Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Circleville, Ohio, a small town nestled in Pickaway County, about 30 miles south of Columbus. Population barely cresting 13,000. The kind of place where neighbors know each other's names. Where Friday night football games draw half the town. Where the annual pumpkin show brings families together every October. Tree-lined streets, modest homes with well-kept lawns, American flags hanging from porches, churches on every other corner. This was a place where people felt safe, where doors were left unlocked, where children rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, where the biggest scandals involved who was dating whom, or which business might be closing down on Main Street. In 1976, Circleville seemed untouched by the chaos that plagued larger cities. No gang violence, no organized crime. The police department handled traffic violations, noise complaints, the occasional domestic dispute. Life moved at a gentle pace, predictable and quiet. But that was about to change. In late 1976, something disturbed the peace of Circleville. Something that would transform this sleepy town into a community gripped by fear, paranoia, and suspicion. Something that would turn neighbors against neighbors, destroy marriages, and ultimately lead to violence and death. It started with a letter. Mary Gillespie was a bus driver for the Westfall local school. District 33 years old, married to Ron Gillespie, mother to a young daughter. She was well liked in the community, known for her reliability and kindness. Every morning she'd wake before dawn, prepare breakfast for her family, kiss her husband goodbye, and head out to drive her route. Children trusted her. Parents trusted her. She took pride in her work in getting every child safely to school and back home again. Ron Gillespie worked as a truck driver, a solid, dependable man. He provided for his family. Came home every evening, spent weekends working on the house or watching football. Their marriage seemed stable, comfortable. They'd been together for years, had built a life together in Circleville. They weren't wealthy, but they had enough. They had each other. They had their daughter, they had their routines. Mary's life revolved around predictable rhythms. The morning routes, the afternoon routes, dinner with the family, evenings spent watching television or reading. She wasn't the type to seek attention or drama. She preferred simplicity, stability. She was content. But in the fall of 1976, Mary Gillespie received a letter that would shatter that contentment forever. The envelope arrived in her mailbox. No return address, typed address label. Nothing unusual about the envelope itself, standard white, business-sized. She might have assumed it was a bill, or perhaps a notice from the school district. She opened it without concern. The letter inside was typed, single-spaced, blunt, accusatory. It claimed that Mary Gillespie was having an affair with the school superintendent, Gordon Massey. The words were crude, explicit. The writer described alleged sexual encounters in graphic detail. The writer claimed to have evidence, to have witnessed things, to know secrets. The tone was venomous, dripping with contempt and moral outrage. The writer demanded that Mary end the affair immediately, or else face public exposure. Mary's hands trembled as she read. Her face flushed. Her heart pounded. This was a lie, a complete fabrication. Mary Gillespie was not having an affair with Gordon Massey. She knew him certainly, he was the superintendent, she was a district employee. They'd exchanged pleasantries at meetings, at school functions. But there was nothing romantic, nothing inappropriate. She was faithful to her husband. She loved Ron. The accusation was absurd, outrageous. But someone had taken the time to type this letter, to mail it to her home, to accuse her of something damaging. Who would do this? Why? Mary's mind raced. She thought of everyone she knew. Neighbors. Parents of children on her bus route. Was someone jealous of her? Angry about something she'd done? Had she unknowingly offended someone? She couldn't make sense of it. She showed the letter to Ron. Ron Gillespie's reaction was immediate and visceral. Anger. Confusion. He trusted Mary, he knew she wasn't having an affair. But the letter's existence enraged him. Someone was spreading lies about his wife, attacking their family, invading their privacy. Who had sent this? What kind of sick person would write something like this? Ron wanted to find out. He wanted answers. He wanted to confront whoever was responsible, but there was no name on the letter. No signature. No clues. They considered going to the police, but what could the police do? It was just a letter. Disturbing, yes, but what if they reported it? Would that make things worse? Would it draw more attention? Would people start gossiping, wondering if there was truth to the accusations? They decided to ignore it, to throw it away and move on. Surely it was a one-time thing. Some disturbed individual with too much time on their hands. It would blow over. But it didn't blow over. More letters to Mary. Another envelope with no return address. Another typed page filled with accusations and threats. This one was even more graphic, more threatening. The writer claimed to be watching Mary, watching her movements, watching her interactions with Gordon Massey. The writer warned that if the affair didn't end, the entire town would know. Copies of the letters would be sent to everyone, neighbors, friends, church members, school board officials. Mary's anxiety intensified. She began looking over her shoulder, wondering if someone was following her, wondering who among her acquaintances could harbor such hatred. She became withdrawn, less social. The letters were poison seeping into her thoughts, her daily life. And then Ron Gillespie received a letter. His letter was different. It didn't accuse him of anything. Instead, it informed him with cold certainty that his wife was cheating on him with Gordon Massey. It urged him to take care of the problem. It suggested that a real man wouldn't tolerate such disrespect. It goaded him, challenged his masculinity, pushed him toward confrontation. Ron was furious. Not because he believed the accusations, he didn't, but because someone was deliberately trying to destroy his marriage, to manipulate him into violence or rash action. This wasn't just gossip. This was targeted harassment. This was psychological warfare. Other people in Circleville began receiving letters too. Gordon Massey himself received letters accusing him of the affair with Mary Gillespie. His wife received letters telling her that her husband was unfaithful. The letters to Mrs. Massey were cruel, mocking her, suggesting she was blind or stupid for not seeing what was happening. Friends and acquaintances of the Gillespies and Masseys received letters warning them about the immoral behavior happening in their community. These letters urged recipients to shun Mary and Gordon, to demand they be fired from their positions, to publicly shame them. The letters all shared certain characteristics. They were typed on what appeared to be the same typewriter, same font, same spacing irregularities. They contained similar language patterns, similar accusations. They were unsigned with no return addresses. They were mailed from Circleville local postmarks. The psychological toll was immense. Mary Gillespie felt like she was living in a nightmare. Everywhere she went, she wondered if people were whispering about her, judging her based on lies. She wondered if the parents of children on her bus route had received letters. She wondered if her own family members had received them. The paranoia was suffocating. Gordon Massey faced similar torment. As superintendent, he was a public figure in Circleville. His reputation mattered. The letters threatened to destroy his career, his marriage, his standing in the community. Even though the accusations were false, he knew that rumors could be as damaging as truth. Mud sticks. People remember scandals even when they're disproven. Ron Gillespie's anger grew. He wanted to protect his wife, to find the person responsible and make them stop. But how? The letters kept coming, and the writer remained invisible, anonymous. The Circleville community began to fracture. Some people believed the letters. Some people thought that where there's smoke, there must be fire. Why else would someone send so many letters if there wasn't some truth to it? Suspicion spread like a virus. Trust eroded. Neighbors eyed each other warily. Others defended Mary and Gordon, insisting the letters were the work of a mentally ill person or a malicious troublemaker. But even the defenders couldn't help but wonder who was writing these letters, and why. Theories emerged. Some speculated it was a jealous coworker. Others thought it might be someone with a grudge against the school district. Some wondered if it was a student or a parent upset about some perceived slight. A few darkly joked that maybe it was someone's twisted idea of entertainment. But no one had evidence. No one had proof. The harassment continued the fall and winter of 1976 into early 1977. The letters became more frequent, more aggressive. The writer seemed emboldened by the lack of consequences, by the inability of victims or authorities to identify them. Mary Gillespie's mental health deteriorated. She had trouble sleeping, she lost weight. She became jumpy, anxious. Every time the mail arrived, her stomach churned. Every ring of the phone made her flinch. She felt violated, invaded. The writer knew where she lived, where she worked, details about her life. It felt like she was being stalked, even though she never saw anyone following her. Ron tried to be supportive, but his own frustration was boiling over. He felt helpless. What kind of man couldn't protect his own wife from harassment? He wanted to do something, anything, to stop this. In early 1977, Ron Gillespie decided to take matters into his own hands. He began his own investigation. He tried to think logically about who might have access to the information in the letters, who might have a motive. He questioned friends subtly, trying to gauge reactions. He paid attention to who seemed overly interested in the situation, who asked too many questions. One name kept surfacing in his mind: Paul Fresher. Paul Fresher was married to Ron's sister, Karen Sue Gillespie Fresher. That made Paul Ron's brother-in-law. The families were connected, saw each other at holidays and family gatherings. Paul worked as a forklift operator at a local factory. He was known to be somewhat odd, socially awkward. Some people found him difficult to read. Ron began to suspect Paul. There was no concrete evidence, just a feeling. Paul would have known about Mary's job, about Gordon Massey, about the family's routines. He would have had access to information. And there was something in Paul's demeanor that bothered Ron. A certain detachment, a lack of empathy. But suspicion isn't proof. Ron couldn't accuse Paul without evidence. And what if he was wrong? Accusing a family member would cause a rift that might never heal. Still, the idea lodged in Ron's mind. He watched Paul more carefully at family gatherings. He tried to engage him in conversation about the letters, to see if Paul would reveal something. But Paul gave nothing away. Meanwhile, the letters continued, and they began to expand beyond the core group of victims. Other residents of Circleville started receiving letters on different topics. Some letters made accusations of infidelity unrelated to Mary and Gordon. Some letters revealed secrets, or claimed to reveal secrets about people's personal lives. Some letters threatened violence. The town was in turmoil. The police received complaints, but they had limited resources and no forensic way to trace the letters. In the 1970s, handwriting analysis was possible, but these letters were typed. Fingerprint analysis was theoretically possible, but the writer had apparently been careful. No clear prints were found on the letters or envelopes. The Circleville police chief at the time was doing what he could, but this type of crime was unusual. Harassment by mail wasn't something the small department had much experience with. They took statements, collected the letters as evidence, but they had no leads, no suspects. The community's fear deepened. If the letter writer could target Mary Gillespie and Gordon Massey so relentlessly, who would be next? Was anyone safe? The anonymity the writer gave them power. They could strike anyone, anytime, and remain hidden. Some residents began to suspect each other. Old grudges resurfaced. If someone had a conflict with a neighbor, they'd wonder, could that person be the letter writer? Paranoia became epidemic. People stopped confiding in each other, afraid their secrets would end up in a letter spread across town. Mary Gillespie continued driving her bus route, but it became increasingly difficult. She felt eyes on her constantly. When she stopped to pick up children, she wondered if their parents had received letters about her. When she saw other school employees, she wondered if they believed the rumors. Her life had become a prison of anxiety and shame for something she hadn't even done. Gordon Massey tried to maintain his professional composure, but the strain showed. His marriage was suffering. His wife, despite knowing the letters were lies, couldn't help but feel hurt and suspicious. The constant barrage of accusations created doubts, even where there should be none. Trust, once broken by outside forces, is hard to repair. Ron Gillespie's obsession with finding the letter writer intensified. He spent hours thinking about it, talking about it, investigating him. His own work began to suffer. His relationship with Mary became strained, not because he blamed her, but because they were both drowning in stress and fear, unable to escape the shadow of the letters. In the spring of 1977, the situation escalated dramatically. Mary Gillespie began receiving phone calls, always late at night. Always the same pattern: the phone would ring, she would answer, and there would be silence on the other end. Sometimes she could hear breathing. Sometimes she thought she heard faint sounds in the background, traffic maybe, or music. But the caller never spoke. These silent calls terrified her more than the letters. The letters came through the mail, impersonal in a way. But the phone calls felt immediate, intrusive. Someone was dialing her number, listening to her voice, invading her home in real time. She reported the calls to the phone company and the police. In the 1970s, tracing calls was difficult and time-consuming. The phone company could potentially trace a call if someone stayed on the line long enough, but these calls were brief. The caller would hang up as soon as Mary or Ron became aggressive or demanding. Ron installed a new lock on their door. He began keeping a gun in the house, a pistol he'd bought for protection. He told Mary that if the letter writer ever tried to approach them directly, he would be ready. The letters and calls continued through the spring and into the summer of 1977. The content of the letters evolved. They were no longer just about the alleged affair. Some letters contained threats of physical violence. One letter warned Mary that she would pay for her sins. Another suggested that acts happened to sinful people. Mary and Ron discussed leaving Circleville, starting over somewhere else, somewhere the letter writer couldn't find them. But leaving would abandoning their home, their jobs, their entire lives. And there was no guarantee the writer wouldn't follow them, wouldn't find their new address. They felt trapped. Gordon Massey and his wife faced similar discussions. But Gordon had built his career in Circleville. Leaving would mean professional ruin in a sense. He'd have to find a new position, rebuild his reputation in a new community. And again, leaving felt like surrender, like letting the letter writer win. In August 1977, the harassment took a darker turn. Mary Gillespie started noticing signs that someone had been on her property. Small things at first: items moved slightly, footprints in the flower bed near a window, a gate left open that she was certain she'd closed. She and Ron became hypervigilant. Ron would patrol the yard at night, flashlight in hand, looking for any sign of an intruder. Occasionally he'd see someone in the distance, a shadow moving between houses. But by the time he'd investigate, there was no one there. Was it the letter writer? Or was the paranoia making them see where none existed? On the night of August 19, 1977, everything changed. Ron Gillespie received a phone call. It was late, nearly midnight. Mary was already asleep. Ron answered, expecting it to be another silent call, another harassment tactic. But this time someone spoke. The voice was male, muffled, possibly disguised. The person on the other end said something. Ron would later tell police that the caller made a comment about Mary and Gordon Massey. Something crude and taunting. Ron snapped. All the months of frustration, anger, helplessness, they erupted. He screamed into the phone, demanding to know who the caller was, the threatening violence if they didn't stop. The caller hung up. Ron was shaking with rage. He woke Mary, told her about what to do. Mary wanted to call the police again, to report it. Ron felt that the police were useless, that they'd done nothing to help. He made a decision. He was going to end this tonight. He was going to find the person responsible. Ron had been developing his own theory about where the calls might be coming from. There was a payphone about a half-mile from their house, outside a local bar. He'd driven past it before, noticed it. If someone was making the calls from there, he could catch them. He grabbed his gun. Mary begged him not to go. She was terrified of what might happen. Terrified that Ron might do something he'd regret. Terrified that the situation was spiraling out of control. But Ron was beyond reason. He kissed her, told her he'd be back soon, and left. He got in his truck and drove toward the bar where the payphone was located. The streets were dark, empty. Circleville was asleep. Only a few streetlights illuminated the roads. As he approached the area near the payphone, he saw something. A shape. Someone standing near the phone booth. Ron's heart raced. This was it, found them. He pulled over, parked hastily, grabbed his gun and got out of the truck. He approached the figure, shouting, "You!" The person turned, startled. Ron couldn't see clearly in the darkness, but the person seemed to hesitate, then started to run. Ron chased after them, gun in hand, adrenaline surging. He was going to catch this person, going to make them confess, going to end this nightmare. But as he ran, something went wrong. Accounts of what happened next are fragmented, based on what police later pieced together. Ron was running fast, not watching his footing carefully. The area near the road was uneven, with ditches and debris. He stumbled. He fell. As he fell, the gun discharged. The bullet struck Ron Gillespie in the chest. He collapsed onto the pavement, bleeding, gasping for air. The person he'd been chasing was gone, vanished into the night. Ron lay there alone, the gun beside him, his blood pooling on the ground. Minutes passed, maybe longer. It's unclear how much time elapsed. Eventually, a passerby spotted him. A man driving home from a late shift saw something on the side of the road, stopped, realized it was a person. He ran to Ron, saw the gunshot wound, the blood, and immediately drove to the nearest phone to call for help. An ambulance arrived within 15 minutes. Paramedics worked frantically trying to stabilize Ron, to stop the bleeding. They loaded him into the ambulance and rushed him to the hospital. But it was too late. Ron Gillespie died from the gunshot wound shortly after arriving at the hospital. He was 35 years old. Mary Gillespie received the news in the middle of the night. Police officers arrived at her door, their faces grim. They told her there had been an accident, that Ron had been shot, that he hadn't survived. She collapsed. Her world disintegrated. Her husband was dead. The man she'd loved, the father of her child, gone. And it was all because of the letters. The letters had driven him to that moment, to that decision, to that chase in the dark. The Circleville Police Department launched an investigation into Ron's death. Initially, they treated it as a potential homicide. Had someone shot Ron? Was the person at the payphone the killer? But the evidence suggested otherwise. Ron's gun was found at the scene, recently fired. The bullet wound trajectory was consistent with an accidental discharge during a fall. There were no witnesses to the actual shooting, but the physical evidence pointed to a tragic accident. The police concluded that Ron Gillespie had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, accidental, sustained while pursuing someone he believed to be the letter writer. No one was charged with murder. But in a broader sense, the letter writer was responsible. The harassment, the fear, the relentless psychological torture, it had led Ron to that moment. Without the letters, he would never have been out there that night. He would still be alive. The community of Circleville was shaken. Ron's death made the letter campaign feel suddenly real, suddenly dangerous. This wasn't just gossip or annoyance anymore. Someone had died. People expected the letters to stop. Surely after such a tragedy the writer would cease. Surely even the most disturbed individual would recognize they'd gone too far. But the letters didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. Mary Gillespie, now a widow, grieving and traumatized, received more letters. These new letters were particularly cruel. They mocked Ron's death. They suggested he'd been weak, foolish. They blamed Mary for his death, saying that if she'd just ended the affair, Ron would still be alive. The psychological cruelty was staggering. Mary was drowning in guilt and sorrow, and the letter writer twisted the knife deeper. Other residents continued to receive letters as well. The writer seemed energized, emboldened. Perhaps they felt powerful knowing they'd indirectly caused a death and faced no consequences. Gordon Massey still received letters accusing him of the affair, now with added vitriol about getting a man killed. The investigation into the letters intensified. The police and the county sheriff's office pooled resources. They collected every letter they could find, looking for patterns, clues, anything that might lead to the writer. Handwriting experts examined the typed letters, noting the specific typewriter used, an older model, with distinctive worn keys that created identifiable imperfections in certain letters. If they could find that typewriter, they could potentially link it to the writer. The police began quietly investigating potential suspects. Paul Fresher, Ron's brother-in-law, was on that list. So were several other individuals who'd had conflicts with the victims or who'd displayed unusual interest in the case. But progress was slow. Without modern forensic tools, without DNA analysis or digital tracking, the investigation relied on old-fashioned detective work, Interviews, surveillance, luck. Mary tried to rebuild her life. She continued working as a bus driver. Though every day was a struggle, she was raising her daughter alone now, coping with grief, enduring ongoing harassment. Friends and family rallied around her, but the shadow of the letters loomed over everything. In early 1978, the letters briefly paused. A few weeks passed without any new arrivals. People dared to hope it was over, that the writer had finally stopped. But in March 1978, the letters resumed, and this time they weren't just sent to individuals. The writer began posting letters in public places. Signs appeared on telephone poles around Circleville, typed sheets of paper in plastic sleeves, accusing Mary Gillespie and Gordon Massey. These public postings were designed to humiliate, to spread the accusations beyond private correspondence into the open. Residents would be driving through town and see these signs. Children walking to school would see them. The entire community was forced to confront the accusations, whether they wanted to or not. Mary felt like she was being publicly executed. Her name, her reputation, destroyed for all to see. She stopped going to church, stopped attending community events. She became a recluse, hiding from the judgment and whispers. Gordon Massey faced similar humiliation. His position as superintendent became untenable. Even though most people knew the accusations were false, the constant scandal made his job impossible. Eventually, he resigned, leaving Circleville to take a position in another district. His departure didn't stop the letters. Even after he left, letters about him continued to circulate, warning his new community about the moral man in their midst. The Circleville letter writer had effectively destroyed multiple lives. Ron Gillespie was dead. Mary Gillespie was a broken woman. Gordon Massey's career was derailed. Families were fractured. The community lived in fear, and still no one knew who was responsible. In 1980, 3 years after Ron's death, the harassment continued. Mary Gillespie had endured more than anyone should have to endure. She'd lost her husband, her reputation, her peace of mind. She'd been mocked, threatened, accused, and humiliated for years. And then, in August 1983, the situation escalated in a way that would finally break the case open. Mary Gillespie was still driving her school bus route. It was late afternoon, the end of the school day. She was driving the usual roads, children chatting in the seats behind her. As she drove along a rural road near the school district's transportation yard, she noticed something odd on the side of the road. A box, small and square, positioned near a yield sign. The box had a string attached to it, stretching across the road. Mary's instincts screamed danger. She stopped the bus immediately, told the children to stay in their seats, and got out to investigate. As she approached the box, she realized what it was. Someone had rigged a booby trap. The box contained a loaded gun, positioned to fire when the string was pulled. The string was set up in such a way that if Mary's bus had driven over it, the tension would have triggered the gun, firing toward the driver's seat, toward her. Someone had tried to kill her. Mary's hands shook. Her breath came in gasps. She carefully backed away from the device, returned to the bus, and drove immediately to the school district office. She called the police. The Pickaway County Sheriff's Department responded. They evacuated the area and called in a bomb squad, or the closest equivalent they had. Experts carefully dismantled the trap, securing the gun and collecting evidence. This was no longer just a harassment campaign. This was attempted murder. The investigation exploded into action. Every resource they counted into finding the person responsible. The booby trap was analyzed for fingerprints, for any trace evidence that might identify the builder. And this time they found something. Fingerprints, on the box, on the gun. On parts of the mechanism, fingerprints that didn't belong to Mary Gillespie. The prints were run through the system, and they got a hit. Paul Fresher, Ron Gillespie's brother-in-law. The man Ron had suspected years earlier. The discovery of Paul Fresher's fingerprints on the booby trap device changed everything. After 7 years of anonymous terror, the Circleville letter writer finally had a face and name and identity. Paul Fresher was arrested on August 29, 1983. He was 43 years old at the time. A quiet man, somewhat unremarkable in appearance. Average height, average build. The kind of person who could blend into a crowd who wouldn't draw attention. He'd worked at the same factory for years, operating a forklift, going through the motions of a routine life. He was married to Karen Sue Gillespie Fresher, Ron Gillespie's sister. They had children together. On the surface, Paul seemed like an ordinary working-class man living an ordinary life in small-town Ohio. But now he was sitting in an interrogation room, facing charges of attempted murder. The police interrogated him for hours. They confronted him with the evidence, his fingerprints on the booby trap, his connection to the victims, his opportunity and potential motive. Paul Fresher denied everything. He admitted he'd been at the location where the booby trap was found. He said he'd seen the suspicious box on the side of the road, had stopped to examine it out of curiosity, and had touched it. That's how his fingerprints got there, he claimed. He had nothing to do with building it, nothing to do with setting it up to kill Mary Gillespie. As for the letters, he vehemently denied writing them. He'd never written a single letter to Mary or Gordon Massey or anyone else. He had no idea who the real letter writer was. The police didn't believe him. The circumstantial evidence was damning. Paul Fresher had intimate knowledge of the Gillespie family. He would have known Mary's schedule, her bus routes, her vulnerabilities. He would have heard Ron's suspicions about the letter writer, would have known the family was suffering. As Ron's brother-in-law, he'd been close to the center of the drama for years, and now his fingerprints were on a device designed to kill Mary Gillespie. The police theorized that Paul had been the letter writer all along. Perhaps he harbored some resentment toward Mary, some grudge. Perhaps he'd been jealous of Ron or the Gillespie family. Perhaps there was some twisted psychological motivation that only Paul understood. When the letters failed to destroy Mary's life, when she continued to survive and persevere despite the harassment, Paul had escalated to murder. The booby trap was meant to be the final act in his campaign of terror. That was the prosecution's theory. Paul continued to insist he was innocent, but his protest seemed hollow, defensive. He couldn't adequately explain why his fingerprints were on the device. His story that he just happened to stumble upon it and touch it seemed implausible. In October 1983, Paul Fresher was formally charged with attempted murder in connection with the booby trap. The trial was set for the following year. The community of Circleville watched the case unfold with intense interest. For years, they'd lived under the shadow of the letters. Now, finally, someone was being held accountable. But some residents weren't convinced Paul Fresher was the letter writer. There were inconsistencies, questions that didn't have clear answers. For one thing, the letters had started in 1976, 7 years before Paul's arrest. Why would he wait so long to escalate to physical violence? Why not earlier, when Ron was still alive and actively investigating? For another, the booby trap was crude. Paul Fresher was a forklift operator, familiar with machinery and mechanical systems. If he'd really wanted to kill Mary Gillespie, wouldn't he have built something more sophisticated, more reliable? And there was the matter of Paul's demeanor. People who knew him described him as passive, non-confrontational. He wasn't the type to engage in dramatic acts of violence. The letter-writing campaign was bold, aggressive, relentless. Did that match Paul's personality? These doubts lingered, but they didn't stop the legal proceedings. In 1984, Paul Fresher went to trial for attempted murder. The prosecution presented their case methodically. They showed the jury the booby trap device, explained how it was designed to function, demonstrated that it could have killed Mary Gillespie if triggered. They presented the fingerprint evidence, showing conclusively that Paul's prints were on the components. They also introduced some of the letters into evidence, arguing that the booby trap was part of a long-term pattern of harassment targeting Mary Gillespie. The defense argued that the fingerprint evidence, while real, didn't prove Paul built the device. He could have touched it innocently, just as he claimed. The prosecution had no witnesses who saw Paul constructing the trap, no physical evidence linking him to its creation beyond the fingerprints. The defense also pointed out that the prosecution couldn't definitively prove Paul wrote the letters. They had no handwriting to compare, no typewriter linked to Paul. The attempted murder charge was based on the booby trap alone, not on the letter-writing campaign. But the jury wasn't swayed by the defense's arguments. The fingerprint evidence was too strong. The connection to the victim was too obvious. The jury concluded that Paul Fresher had built the booby trap with the intent to kill Mary Gillespie. In August 1984, Paul Fresher was convicted of attempted murder. He was sentenced to 7 to 25 years in prison. As he was led out of the courtroom, Paul maintained his innocence. He told reporters, he told anyone who would listen, that he didn't build the booby trap, that he wasn't the letter writer, that the real culprit was still out there. No one believed him. Mary Gillespie felt a measure of relief. The man who'd tormented her for years, who'd killed her husband indirectly, who'd tried to kill her directly, was finally behind bars. She could begin to heal, to rebuild her life without fear. The community of Circleville breathed easier. The nightmare was over. Paul Fresher was in prison. But the haters would stop. In 1985, while Paul Fresher was locked away in the Lima Correctional Institution, new letters began to appear in Circleville. At first it was just a few. Recipients assumed they were copycats, people inspired by the original letters, seeking attention or trying to reignite the old fears. But these new letters had the same tone, the same style, the same obsessive focus on Mary Gillespie and others who'd been targeted before. And they contained information that only the original letter writer would know, details about the case, about the victims, about events that had never been made public. The realization spread slowly through the community: the real letter writer was still active. Paul Fresher, sitting in a prison cell, couldn't have sent these letters. He had no access to typewriters, no way to mail letters without them being logged and monitored by prison officials. Every piece of mail sent from the prison was screened. If the letters were continuing, that meant one of two things: either Paul had an accomplice on the outside, continuing his work, or Paul was innocent, and the real letter writer had never been caught. The Pickaway County Sheriff's Department investigated the new letters. They tried to trace them, to identify the source, but once again they hit dead ends. No return addresses, no fingerprints, no clear leads. Paul Fresher, from his prison cell, repeated his claims of innocence. See, he told his attorney, told anyone who would listen. The letters are still coming. I told you I wasn't the writer. But no one believed me. His conviction for attempted murder stood. The fingerprint evidence was undeniable. But the question of whether he was the letter writer became murkier. Mary Gillespie received more letters. Even after everything, even after Paul's conviction, the harassment continued. The letters mocked Paul's imprisonment, suggested he was a fool taking the fall for someone else, taunted Mary that she'd never be free. The psychological toll on Mary was immense. She'd thought it was over. She'd testified at the trial, relived all the trauma, believing that justice had been served and she could finally move on. Now she realized the nightmare wasn't over. It might never be over. The community's confidence shattered. If Paul Fresher wasn't the letter writer, then who was? Was it someone they knew, someone they saw every day? The paranoia returned. Worse than before, because now there was a sense of betrayal. They'd believed the case was solved, and it wasn't. Some people began to question Paul's conviction. Had the police arrested the wrong man? Had they been so eager to solve the case that they'd built a circumstantial case against someone who happened to have touched the booby trap? Others argued that Paul must have had an accomplice, probably his wife Karen. Maybe Karen was continuing the letters while Paul was in prison. Maybe they'd been working together all along. Karen Fresher denied any involvement. She insisted Paul was innocent, that their family had been torn apart by a false conviction. She and Paul divorced while he was in prison. The strain of the case and the conviction too much for their marriage to survive. The investigation into the new letters went nowhere. The police had no new leads, no new evidence. They were back where they'd started in 1976. Anonymous letters, unknown writer, no way to stop it. Paul Fresher, meanwhile, was fighting his conviction from prison. He filed appeals, arguing that the evidence against him was insufficient, that the prosecution had failed to prove he built the booby trap beyond reasonable doubt. His appeals were denied, one after another. The courts ruled that the fingerprint evidence was sufficient for conviction, that the jury had been presented with the facts and had reached a valid conclusion. But Paul didn't give up. He continued to maintain his innocence. continued to insist that the real letter writer was still out there. In 1990, while still in prison, Paul Freshour received a letter. It was from the Circleville letter writer. The letter was addressed to Paul personally, sent to him at the prison. It mocked him for being in prison for crimes he didn't commit. It revealed details about the booby trap that had never been made public, suggesting the writer had first-hand knowledge. The letter was cruel taunting. It suggested that Paul had been set up, that his fingerprints had been planted on the device, that he'd been chosen as a convenient scapegoat. Paul showed the letter to prison officials, who forwarded it to law enforcement. Here was potential evidence that Paul was telling the truth, that the real letter writer was someone else. But the letter couldn't be traced. Like all the others before it, it had no return address, no identifiable source. The typewriter appeared to be the same one used in previous letters, same font, same worn keys, but that didn't help identify the writer. The authorities investigated, but again, they found nothing. The letter to Paul became just one more piece in an unsolvable puzzle. Mary Gillespie continued to recede her sporadically through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. The frequency decreased, sometimes months would pass between letters, but they never completely stopped. Each new letter was a fresh wound, a reminder that she was still being watched, still being targeted. She considered leaving Circleville again, but where would she go? And how could she be sure the writer wouldn't find her? The writer had demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to acquire information, to stay one step ahead. So Mary stayed. She lived quietly, kept to herself, tried to minimize her presence in the community. She eventually retired from her job as a school bus driver, hoping that removing herself from public view might end the harassment. It didn't. The letters continued to reference her even in retirement. The writer seemed to know her movements, her activities. If she visited someone, if she went to the store, the next letter might mention it. The surveillance, real or perceived, was constant. Gordon Massey, the school superintendent whose alleged affair had started the whole nightmare, had long since left Circleville. He'd rebuilt his career elsewhere, tried to move on. But even he received occasional letters in his new location, reminders that the writer hadn't forgotten him. The original cast of victims lived under a permanent cloud. The letters had stolen years of their lives, had killed Ron Gillespie, had destroyed marriages and careers and mental health. And the person responsible remained unknown. Over the years, various theories emerged about the true identity of the Circleville letter writer. Some people believed it was Karen Freshour, Paul's ex-wife. The theory went that Karen had written the letters, possibly with Paul's help initially, and then continued alone after his imprisonment. Perhaps she harbored some resentment toward Mary, some jealousy or anger. Perhaps there was some family dynamic no one fully understood. But Karen had been investigated extensively, and there was no evidence linking her to the letters. She'd voluntarily submitted to police interviews, had allowed her home to be searched. No typewriter was found, no evidence of letter writing materials, nothing. Other theories pointed to various residents of Circleville who'd had conflicts with the victims or who displayed suspicious behavior. Over the years, dozens of people were quietly investigated, interviewed, or surveilled. No solid evidence ever emerged against anyone. Some people speculated that the letter writer might have died at some point in the 1990s, which would explain why the letters eventually became less frequent, and then apparently stopped altogether. But without knowing who the writer was, this was just speculation. A few conspiracy-minded individuals suggested that the letter writer was someone in law enforcement, which would explain how they evaded capture for so long, how they seemed to know details about the investigation. This theory was unpopular and unsupported by evidence, but it persisted in whispered conversations. One of the most disturbing theories was that there were multiple letter writers, that the campaign had started with one person, but had been taken up by others over the years, a kind of collaborative harassment. This would explain the continuation of letters after Paul's imprisonment, and would explain why the letters sometimes seemed to have slightly different tones or focuses. But again, no evidence supported this theory. The truth remained elusive. Paul Freshour served his sentence at the Lima Correctional Institution. He was a model prisoner, causing no trouble, following all rules. He continued to maintain his innocence, though after years of appeals being denied, he stopped actively fighting the conviction. In 1994, after serving 10 years, Paul Fresher was released on parole. He returned to Pickaway County, though not to Circleville itself. He found work, kept a low profile, tried to rebuild what remained of his life. His release was controversial. Some people in the community were outraged that the Circleville letter writer was free. Others believed he'd been wrongfully convicted and saw his release as long overdue. Mary Gillespie was terrified when she heard Paul was being released. She feared retaliation, feared the harassment would intensify. She took extra precautions, varied her routine, stayed alert. But Paul made no attempt to contact her. He stayed away from her, away from anyone connected to the case. And interestingly, after Paul's release, there were no new letters. This fact was noted by investigators and journalists who'd followed the case. If the letters had continued while Paul was in prison, proving he wasn't the writer, why did they stop after his release? Some argued this proved Paul was the writer after all, that he'd had an accomplice who'd sent letters while he was imprisoned. But once he was free, there was no need to continue the charade. Others argued that the real letter writer had simply stopped by coincidence, or had died or had lost interest. The debate continued unresolved. Paul Fresher lived quietly for the next decade. He worked, he kept to himself, he avoided any situation that might bring attention. He was a man marked by his conviction, unable to fully clear his name but unable to move on either. In 2012, Paul Fresher died of natural causes. He was 72 years old. He never confessed to writing the letters. He never admitted to booby trap beyond what the fingerprint evidence proved. To his dying day, he maintained that he'd been wrongly convicted, that the real letter writer had escaped justice. With Paul's death, one potential source of truth was lost forever. If he had been the letter writer, he took that secret to his grave. If he'd been innocent, he died having spent 10 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Mary Gillespie outlived Paul by several years. She lived into her 70s, still residing in the Circleville area. She rarely spoke publicly about the case, declined most interview requests, tried to live her remaining years in peace. She died in 2019, having endured more than 4 decades of aftermath from the letter writing campaign that destroyed her life. Gordon Massey, the other major victim, also lived into old age, though he never returned to Circleville. His career recovered somewhat after he left, but the scandal always followed him. He passed away in 2016. The Circleville letters case remains officially unsolved. Paul Fresher was convicted of attempted murder for the booby trap, but no one was ever charged with writing the letters. With the harassment campaign, with the psychological torture that spanned decades, the case has been featured in true crime documentaries, podcasts, books, and television shows. It's become one of the most notorious unsolved mysteries in Ohio history. Various journalists and investigators have tried to crack the case over the years, using modern technology and forensic techniques that weren't available in the 1970s and 1980s. Some have attempted to analyze the letters using linguistic forensics, looking for patterns in word choice, sentence structure, and syntax that might reveal the writer's identity or background. These analyses have yielded interesting insights, but no definitive conclusions. The typewriter used to write the letters was never found. If it still exists somewhere, perhaps in an attic or basement, it could theoretically be matched to the letters. But after all these years, it's likely been destroyed or lost. Some investigators have tried to track down relatives of potential suspects, hoping to find evidence that was missed in the original investigations. A few have claimed to have solved the case, pointing to various individuals as the true letter writer, but none of these claims have been substantiated. The most thorough reinvestigation came in 2017, when a team of journalists and forensic experts examined all available evidence. They interviewed surviving witnesses, reviewed police files, analyzed the letters with modern techniques. Their conclusion was frustrating but honest based on available evidence. It's impossible to definitively identify the Circleville letter writer. Paul Fresher remains the only person ever convicted in connection with the case, and even that conviction is disputed. The journalists did offer some observations. First, The letters showed a level of knowledge about the victims that suggested the writer was someone local, someone embedded in a circular community. This wasn't a random outsider. This was someone who knew the victims personally or had access to detailed information about their lives. Second, the obsessive focus on Mary Gillespie and Gordon Massey suggested a personal motive. The writer wasn't targeting random people. There was specific anger or resentment directed at these individuals. Understanding that motive revealed the writer's identity. Third, the fact that the letters continued for so long through so much scrutiny and investigation suggested the writer was either extremely careful and intelligent, or extremely lucky, or both. Fourth, the continuation of letters while Paul Fresher was in prison strongly suggested either that Paul was innocent, or that he had a dedicated accomplice willing to continue the campaign in his absence. But observations aren't answers. The journalists couldn't solve the case, couldn't provide closure. The Circleville letter writer remains a ghost, a shadow figure who terrorized a small Ohio town for decades, and then vanished without ever being definitively identified. So what? Know that in 1976, someone began sending anonymous letters to residents of Circleville, Ohio, making accusations primarily focused on Mary Gillespie and Gordon Massey. We know these letters continued for years, escalating in frequency and vitriol. We know that Ron Gillespie, Mary's husband, died in 1977 while pursuing someone he believed to be the letter writer, a death that, while ruled accidental, was directly caused by the harassment campaign. We know that in 1983, someone built a booby trap designed to kill Mary Gillespie, and that Paul Fresher's fingerprints were found on that device. We know Paul was convicted of attempted murder and served 10 years in prison. We know that letters continued to appear while Paul was imprisoned, raising serious questions about his guilt as the letter writer. We know the letters eventually stopped at some point in the 1990s or early 2000s. The exact end date is unclear because recipients stopped reporting them. We know that no one else was ever arrested or charged in connection with the letters. Everything else is speculation, theory, circumstantial evidence. The question that haunts everyone who studies this case: if Paul Fresher wasn't the letter writer, then who was? Let's examine some of the most credible theories and suspects. Theory 1: Paul Fresher was the letter writer, with his wife Karen as an accomplice. This theory suggests that Paul wrote the letters initially, driven by some resentment toward Mary or the Gillespie family. When Ron began investigating, Paul became concerned about being caught. He built the booby trap as a final solution: kill Mary and end the situation. When Paul was arrested, Karen continued writing letters to create the illusion that Paul was innocent, that the real writer was still free. This would help Paul's appeals and possibly get him released. The letters stopped after Paul's release, because there was no longer a need to maintain the illusion. Evidence supporting this theory: Paul's fingerprints on the booby trap. His connection to the family gave him knowledge needed to write the letters. Karen's access to information and her loyalty to Paul would explain the continuation of letters during his imprisonment. Evidence against this theory: Karen was investigated and no evidence was found linking her to the letters. She and Paul divorced, suggesting their relationship deteriorated. Would she continue such an elaborate deception for an ex-husband? The letters contained information that seemed to go beyond what Paul or Karen would have known. Theory 2: Paul Fresher was innocent, and the real letter writer was someone else in the community who set him up. This theory suggests that the letter writer, knowing Paul was under suspicion, deliberately planted evidence to frame him. The writer might have obtained items Paul had touched and used them to construct the booby trap, ensuring his fingerprints would be found. The letters continued after Paul's imprisonment because the real writer was still free and wanted to torment the victims further. Evidence supporting this theory: the continuation of letters while Paul was in prison is strong evidence he wasn't the writer. Paul consistently maintained his innocence. The booby trap seemed out of character for Paul. Evidence against this theory: it's difficult to explain how the writer would have obtained Paul's fingerprints to plant on the booby trap. The police found no evidence of frame-up or conspiracy. This theory requires a level of sophisticated planning that seems inconsistent with other aspects of the case. Theory 3. There were multiple letter writers over the years. This theory suggests the letter-writing campaign was taken up by different people at different times. Perhaps it started with one person in 1976, but others in the community, enjoying the chaos or harboring their own resentments, joined in. This would explain why the letters sometimes seemed inconsistent in tone or focus. It would explain how the letters continued despite investigations and arrests. Evidence supporting this theory. The letters did span an unusually long time for a single obsessive individual. Some letters focused on different topics or targets, suggesting different motivations. Evidence against this theory. The typewriter analysis suggested a single machine was used for most letters. The core obsession with Mary Gillespie remained consistent throughout. It's unlikely multiple people would coordinate so effectively without evidence of their collaboration emerging. Theory 4. The letter writer was someone in Mary Gillespie's inner circle, a friend, relative, or close acquaintance. This theory suggests someone very close to Mary, someone who seemed supportive on the surface but harbored deep resentment, was the true writer. This person would have had intimate knowledge of Mary's life, would have known details that appeared in the letters, would have had opportunity to observe her closely. Evidence supporting this theory. The letters contained very specific, personal information. The obsessive focus on Mary suggests deep personal resentment. Someone close to Mary could have sustained the campaign for years without detection. Evidence against this theory. Mary was investigated extensively, as were her close contacts. Police found no evidence pointing to any specific individual in her circle. This theory doesn't explain the booby trap or Paul's fingerprints. Theory 5. The letter writer died or moved away in the 1990s, which is why the letters stopped. This is less a theory about identity and more an explanation for the cessation of letters. If the writer was someone who died or left the area, the letters would naturally stop. Evidence supporting this theory. The letters did eventually stop, suggesting some change in the writer's circumstances. Death, serious illness, incarceration for an unrelated crime, or relocation could all explain this. Evidence against this theory. It's purely speculative. Without knowing who the writer was, we can't verify if they died or moved. It also doesn't help identify the writer. None of these theories is entirely satisfactory. Each has gaps, questions that can be answered with available evidence. The frustrating truth is that the Circleville letter writer might have taken their identity to the grave. Unless someone comes forward with a deathbed confession, or unless physical evidence emerges that can be tested with modern forensics, the case will likely remain unsolved. But the case raises broader questions worth considering. How was the letter writer able to evade capture for so long? What does this say about the limitations of law enforcement, especially in an era before digital forensics and advanced surveillance? In the 1970s and 1980s, anonymous harassment was difficult to trace. There were no security cameras on every corner, no digital footprints to follow. Someone could type a letter, mail it from a public mailbox, and leave virtually no evidence. The anonymity that seems impossible today was relatively easy to maintain then. The Circleville letter writer exploited these limitations brilliantly. They never made mistakes, or if they did, the mistakes weren't caught. They never revealed themselves accidentally, never let their guard down. This suggests either remarkable discipline and intelligence, or remarkable luck. Another question: what motivated the letter writer? What kind of person sustains a harassment campaign for decades? The psychological profile of the letter writer is chilling. This was someone with deep obsessive resentment. Someone willing to cause immense suffering to satisfy their need for control or revenge. Someone who enjoyed the power they wielded over their victims. The letter writer was probably someone who felt powerless in other areas of their life. The letters gave them power to terrorize, to control, to destroy. That's a common pattern in harassment cases. They might have been someone with a personality disorder, narcissistic traits, antisocial traits, paranoid traits. Someone who felt wronged or slighted by Mary Gillespie or others, and who responded with disproportionate rage. Or they might have been someone more ordinary. Someone who discovered they enjoyed the feeling of tormenting others, and became addicted to it. We'll never know the answer unless the writer's identity is revealed. The impact of the Circleville letters extended far beyond the primary victims. The entire community of Circleville was transformed by the terror campaign, in ways both obvious and subtle. In the years during the peak of the letter writing, from 1976 through the mid-1980s, Circleville became a town defined by suspicion and fear. Neighbors who had lived side by side for decades began to view each other differently. Every conversation carried an undercurrent of wariness. Was this person the letter writer? Could this friendly face hide such malice? Social gatherings became strained. People were careful about what they said, what they revealed about themselves. After all, any piece of personal information might end up in a letter, broadcast to the entire town. Confidences were broken. Friendships dissolved. The psychological concept of ambient fear describes what Circleville experienced. It wasn't just that specific individuals were being targeted. It was that everyone felt potentially vulnerable. The letter writer had demonstrated the ability to acquire information, to observe people's lives, to strike without warning. Anyone could be next. This ambient fear changed behavior in measurable ways. People became more secretive, more isolated. Community involvement declined. Church attendance dropped in some congregations because people didn't want to be seen, didn't want to gather in groups where they might be observed or gossiped about. Local businesses suffered. Some people avoided shopping in Circleville, driving to neighboring towns instead, irrationally hoping to escape the letter writer's attention. Restaurants and cafes that had been social hubs became quieter, emptier. Real estate agents reported difficulty selling homes in Circleville during the peak years. The town had developed a reputation, and people were reluctant to move there. Who would want to relocate to a place known for anonymous harassment and unsolved mysteries? The psychological toll on the broader community was immense. Though less documented than the suffering of the primary victims, children growing up in Circleville during this period absorbed the ambient fear. They heard their parents whispering about the letters, saw the tension in adult faces, felt the change in their town's atmosphere. Some children developed anxiety disorders, though the connection to the letters was often not explicitly recognized. Teachers reported increased behavioral problems in schools. Children acted out, became more aggressive or more withdrawn. The community's stress filtered down to its youngest members. Teenagers and young adults faced a different set of challenges. The letters had sexualized the scandal, making explicit accusations about affairs and intimate details. This created an uncomfortable atmosphere around discussions of relationships and sexuality. Parents became more controlling, more suspicious of their children's activities. Some young people left Circleville as soon as they could, seeking escape from the oppressive atmosphere. The town experienced a brain drain. Talented, ambitious young people who might have stayed and contributed to the community instead fled to Columbus, to Cincinnati, to anywhere else. The elderly population of Circleville struggled with the violation of their sense of safety. Many had lived in the town their entire lives, had raised families there, had believed it was a sanctuary from the dangers of the modern world. The letters shattered that belief. Some older residents became homebound, afraid to go out, afraid to engage with the community they'd once loved. Law enforcement in Circleville faced enormous pressure and criticism. The Circleville Police Department and the Pickaway County Sheriff's Office were small, underfunded, and unprepared for a case of this complexity. The officers worked countless hours, followed every lead, interviewed dozens of suspects, but without a breakthrough, without physical evidence that could be definitively linked to a perpetrator, they were helpless. The community's frustration with law enforcement grew. Why couldn't they solve this? Why couldn't they protect people? The letters kept coming year after year, and the police seemed unable to stop them. This frustration was somewhat unfair. The police were dealing with a type of crime that was exceptionally difficult to solve with technology and methods available at the time. But fairness didn't matter to residents who were living in fear. Some officers became obsessed with the case, working on it even when off duty, spending their own money to follow leads. The failure to solve it ate at them. They'd become police officers to help people, to bring criminals to justice. The Circleville letter writer made them feel impotent. Other officers burned out, requesting transfers to other departments or leaving law enforcement altogether. The stress, the criticism, the sense of futility, it was too much. The case also created internal tensions within law enforcement. Different officers had different theories about the letter writer's identity. Some were convinced Paul Freshour was guilty. Others believed he'd been wrongly convicted. These disagreements created friction, undermined cooperation. When Paul was convicted in 1984, some officers felt vindicated. They'd caught the perpetrator, even if they couldn't definitively prove he wrote all the letters. The attempted murder conviction was enough. But when the letters continued after Paul's imprisonment, those same officers felt humiliated. They'd publicly declared the case solved, had reassured the community, and now they had to admit they might have been wrong. The media attention on Circleville added another layer of complexity to the situation. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the case attracted regional news coverage. Newspapers from Columbus and other Ohio cities sent reporters to investigate. The story was compelling: a small town terrorized by anonymous letters, a tragic death, an unsolved mystery. Some of the media coverage was responsible and accurate, but some sensationalized the case, exaggerating details, speculating wildly about the letter writer's identity and motives. This media attention had mixed effects. On one hand, it brought outside resources and attention to the case. Tips came in from across the state. Experts offered assistance. The pressure on law enforcement to solve the case intensified. On the other hand, the media attention made life worse for the victims. Mary Gillespie found herself ambushed by reporters, asked invasive questions about her alleged affair, forced to relive her trauma for the cameras. Gordon Massey faced similar intrusions. The media also turned Circleville into a spectacle. Tourists and curiosity seekers began visiting, driving through neighborhoods, trying to spot the locations mentioned in news stories. Residents felt like exhibits in a museum of dysfunction. After Paul Freshour's conviction, media interest waned somewhat. The case seemed solved, the story complete. But when letters continued to appear, journalists returned and the cycle began again. In the 1990s and 2000s, as true crime became a popular genre, the Circleville letters case was rediscovered by a new generation of media. Documentaries were produced, books were written. The case appeared on television shows dedicated to unsolved mysteries. Each new wave of media attention brought renewed pain to the surviving victims and their families. They were forced to relive the trauma, to see their suffering packaged as entertainment. Mary Gillespie, in the few interviews she gave later in life, expressed deep ambivalence about the media coverage. She wanted the case solved, and media attention sometimes generated new leads. But she also felt exploited, reduced to a character in a story rather than a real person who had suffered real harm. The religious community in Circleville struggled with the letter writing campaign in unique ways. Circleville, like much of small-town Ohio, was deeply religious. Churches were central to community life. People found meaning, community, and moral guidance through their faith. The letters challenged this faith in several ways. First, the letters often invoked religious language and moral judgments. The writer condemned Mary Gillespie and Gordon Massey as sinners, quoted Bible verses, positioned themselves as a moral arbiter punishing the wicked. This created a theological problem for religious leaders in Circleville. They had to address the fact that someone was using religious language to justify harassment and terror. They had to help their congregations understand that true faith doesn't manifest in anonymous cruelty. Some pastors preached sermons about the letters, condemning the writer, emphasizing Christian values of forgiveness and love. They tried to counter the toxic religiosity of the letters with authentic spiritual teaching, but some religious people in Circleville were conflicted. If the accusations in the letters were true, if Mary really was having an affair, then wasn't the letter writer right to expose sin? Shouldn't immorality be confronted? These people struggled with the tension between their moral convictions and their recognition that the letter writer's methods were wrong. Some resolved this tension by believing the letters, by shunning Mary and Gordon, by treating them as pariahs. This created divisions within churches. Some members defended Mary and Gordon. Others condemned them. The letters succeeded in fracturing religious communities, turning congregations against themselves. After Ron Gillespie's death, religious leaders faced another challenge: how to make sense of such a senseless tragedy. Ron had died chasing a phantom, driven to recklessness by anonymous accusations. Where was God in that? Why had such suffering been allowed? Funeral services and memorial services grappled with these questions. Some offered traditional comfort. Ron was in a better place. His suffering had ended. God had a plan. Others acknowledged the injustice and senselessness, offering no easy answers. The letters also affected people's prayer lives and spiritual practices. Many residents prayed for the letter writer to be caught, for the harassment to end, for peace to return to their community. When these prayers seemed to go unanswered, year after year, some people's faith was shaken. Others found their faith strengthened by the crisis. They saw the community's suffering as a test, an opportunity to demonstrate resilience and love. They organized prayer groups, support networks, charitable efforts to help the victims. The religious response to the Circleville letters was as complex and varied as the community itself. As the years passed and the case remained unsolved, Circleville gradually adapted to a new normal. By the late 1980s, residents had lived with the letters for over a decade. The initial shock had faded. The letters had become a grim fact of life, like crime or illness, something to endure rather than something that could be prevented or solved. People developed coping mechanisms. They stopped opening mail that looked suspicious. They ignored anonymous phone calls. They became desensitized to the accusations and threats, treating them as background noise rather than immediate danger. This adaptation was necessary for psychological survival, but it came at a cost. The community had normalized terror. They'd accepted that some members of their community would be harassed, that the perpetrator would never be caught, that justice would never be served. This normalization changed Circleville's character. The town became harder, more cynical, less trusting. The innocence and openness that had characterized small town life were replaced by wariness and skepticism. New residents moving to Circleville after the mid-1980s often didn't know about the letters initially, but they'd quickly sensed something was off about the town. People were oddly guarded. Conversations had strange boundaries. There were topics that seemed taboo. Eventually, someone would explain about the letters, about the terror campaign that had defined the town for so long. New residents would then understand the undercurrent of fear and suspicion they'd sensed. Some new residents left quickly, uncomfortable with the atmosphere. Others stayed, integrating into the community's damaged social fabric. Children who'd grown up during the peak years of the letters reached adulthood, carrying the psychological imprint of that experience. Some developed anxiety disorders, trust issues, or paranoia. Others became unusually resilient, having learned to cope with sustained uncertainty and threat. These children, now adults, formed a generation marked by the Circleville letters. They shared a common traumatic background, even if they hadn't been direct victims. This shared experience created a bond among them, but also a burden they carried into their adult lives. The Circleville letters case also had implications for law enforcement and legal practice beyond Circleville. The case became a teaching example in criminal justice programs, illustrating the challenges of investigating harassment crimes, the limitations of forensic technology, and the importance of psychological profiling. Law enforcement agencies studied the case to understand how to better handle similar situations. What could the Circleville police have done differently? What investigative techniques might have been more effective? Some lessons emerged. First, harassment campaigns should be taken seriously from the beginning, before they escalate to violence. In the Circleville case, the early letters were disturbing but not immediately dangerous. If more resources had been devoted to investigation earlier, perhaps the escalation could have been prevented. Second, community cooperation is essential but difficult to maintain. In Circleville, the ambient fear and suspicion made it hard for police to get honest information from residents. People were afraid to talk, afraid to speculate, afraid of becoming targets themselves. Third, forensic limitations can be crippling. In the 1970s and 1980s, there was no DNA analysis, no digital forensics, limited surveillance technology. Modern investigators have tools that would have been invaluable in the Circleville case, but those tools didn't exist then. Fourth, psychological profiling can help narrow suspect lists, but it's not a substitute for physical evidence. Investigators develop profiles of the likely letter writer, but without evidence to link a specific person to the crimes, the profiles were just educated guesses. The case also highlighted the legal challenges of prosecuting harassment. Paul Fresher was convicted of attempted murder because of the booby trap, a clear physical crime with tangible evidence. But no one was ever prosecuted for writing the letters, because proving authorship without physical evidence was nearly impossible. This legal gap frustrated law enforcement and victims alike. The letters were the core of the terror campaign, but they were also the hardest part to prosecute. In subsequent decades, laws regarding stalking, harassment, and cyberbullying were strengthened, partly in response to cases like Circleville. Legislators recognized that psychological harm can be as devastating as physical harm, and that anonymous harassment needed to be taken seriously. But these legal changes came too late for Mary Gillespie and the other Circleville victims. The psychological analysis of the Circleville letter writer, though speculative, offers insights into the type of person capable of sustaining such a campaign. Forensic psychologists who've studied the case suggest several psychological profiles. Profile 1. The obsessive avenger. This type of letter writer is motivated by a perceived injustice or wrong. They believe Mary Gillespie or Gordon Massey did something that deserves punishment. Perhaps they believe the affair actually occurred and see themselves as a moral crusader. Or perhaps they experience some unrelated slight from the victims and fixated on revenge. This type is characterized by rigidity, black and white thinking, and inability to let go of grievances. They see themselves as righteous, justified in their actions. They don't experience guilt or empathy for their victims. The obsessive avenger can sustain a campaign for years because they're driven by deep psychological need. The harassment gives their life meaning and purpose. Profile 2. The power-seeking sadist. This type of letter writer is motivated primarily by the sense of power and control over others. They enjoy causing fear and suffering. The specific victims matter less than the act of terrorizing. This type is characterized by sadistic personality traits, narcissism, and antisocial behavior. They lack empathy and remorse. They're often intelligent and capable of long-term planning. The power-seeking sadist can sustain a campaign for years because they derive pleasure from it. Each letter, each fearful response from a victim provides satisfaction. Profile 3. The paranoid grudge holder. This type of letter writer has paranoid personality traits. They see threats and conspiracies where none exist. They might genuinely believe that Mary Gillespie and Gordon Massey are part of some larger pattern of immorality or corruption that must be exposed. This type is characterized by suspicious thinking, difficulty trusting others, and tendency to interpret neutral actions as hostile. They see themselves as one of the few people who knows the truth. The paranoid grudge holder can sustain a campaign for years because they're convinced they're fighting a real and important battle. Their paranoia provides fuel for ongoing harassment. Profile 4. The attention-seeking disruptor. This type of letter writer is motivated by the desire for attention and excitement. They find their normal life boring and create drama to add interest. They enjoy being at the center of a mystery, even if no one knows they're responsible. This type is characterized by histrionic personality traits, need for stimulation, and lack of concern for others' well-being. They might brag about their actions in coded ways, drop hints, enjoy watching people speculate. The attention-seeking disruptor can sustain a campaign for years, as long as it remains interesting and exciting. They might stop when they find another source of stimulation, or when they fear getting caught. Each of these profiles fits aspects of the Circleville letter writer's behavior, but none fits perfectly. The true writer might have combined elements from multiple profiles, or might have been motivated by factors not captured in these categories. What's clear is that the letter writer had certain qualities: intelligence and planning ability. The writer evaded capture for decades, suggesting they were careful and thoughtful in their methods. Access to information. The writer knew details about victims' lives, suggesting either proximity to the victims or effective surveillance. Psychological resilience. The writer maintained their campaign through intense investigation and public scrutiny, suggesting they could handle stress and pressure. Lack of empathy. The writer caused immense suffering without apparent remorse, suggesting they either didn't feel empathy or actively enjoyed others' pain. Long-term commitment. Most harassment campaigns burn out relatively quickly. The Circleville letters lasted for decades, suggesting unusual psychological stamina. Understanding these qualities doesn't identify the writer, but it helps us understand what kind of person could do such things. The impact of the Circleville letters on the victims' families extended across generations. Mary Gillespie's daughter grew up in the shadow of the letters. Her childhood was marked by her mother's trauma, her father's death, the community's judgment. She watched her mother suffer, year after year, unable to protect her or make it stop. As an adult, Mary's daughter struggled with trust issues and anxiety. She was reluctant to form close relationships, fearing that intimacy would lead to vulnerability and hurt. She left Circleville as soon as she could, seeking distance from the place that held so much pain. In interviews years later, she spoke about the difficulty of growing up as the daughter of the Circleville letters victim. Her identity was bound up with a crime she hadn't committed, a scandal she hadn't created. She resented the letter writer for stealing her childhood, for making her mother's suffering the defining feature of their family life. Ron Gillespie's extended family, his parents, siblings, and other relatives also bore scars from the case. They'd lost Ron in a senseless tragedy. They'd watched the investigation flounder, watched Paul Fresher be convicted and then questioned. They'd never received clear answers or closure. Some family members believed Paul was guilty and found some peace in his conviction. Others believed he was innocent and felt the injustice of a wrongful conviction. These differing beliefs created rifts within the family that never fully healed. Ron's parents, in particular, suffered tremendously. They'd lost their son to a situation they didn't fully understand, driven by letters they'd never seen, written by someone they'd never met. The randomness and senselessness of it was unbearable. They devoted years to trying to understand what happened, to finding answers. But the answers never came. They died without knowing who the letter writer was, without seeing justice fully served. Gordon Massey's family also struggled. His children grew up hearing rumors and accusations about their father. Even though the affair allegations were false, the scandal tainted their family name. Massey's wife never fully recovered from the emotional damage of the letters. The accusations of infidelity, even though false, created doubts and insecurities that eroded her marriage. She and Gordon eventually divorced, another casualty of the letter writing campaign. The children carried the weight of the scandal into adulthood. They were defensive about their father's reputation, quick to explain that the accusations were lies. But the need to constantly defend and explain was exhausting and humiliating. The intergenerational trauma created by the Circleville letters is a hidden dimension of the case. The direct victims suffered most, but their children, grandchildren, and extended families also paid a price. This pattern is common in cases of sustained harassment or terrorism. The immediate harm is obvious, but the ripple effects extend far beyond the direct victims, touching everyone connected to them. In Circleville, entire family trees were marked by the letters. Grandchildren who were born long after the letters stopped still grew up hearing stories about what happened, still felt the legacy of fear and suspicion. The economic impact of the Circleville letters on the victims is often overlooked but significant. Mary Gillespie faced substantial financial costs. She had legal expenses related to the investigation and the trial. She had security expenses installing better locks, potentially moving to a safer location, taking other protective measures. She also faced lost income. The stress and trauma affected her ability to work. She took time off, worked reduced hours, eventually retired earlier than planned. Over the course of her career, this likely cost her tens of thousands of dollars in lost wages and retirement benefits. Ron Gillespie's death created additional financial hardship. Mary lost his income, had funeral expenses, and faced the costs of raising a child as a single parent. Gordon Massey's career was derailed by the scandal. He had to leave his position as superintendent, taking a significant pay cut when he found a new position elsewhere. His retirement benefits were affected. His professional opportunities were limited. Over the course of his career, the letters probably cost him hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost income and advancement opportunities. Paul Fresher, if he was innocent as he claimed, faced catastrophic economic consequences. He lost 10 years of potential income while imprisoned. He lost his marriage, his home, his savings. When he was released, he had a felony conviction that made employment difficult. If Paul was wrongly convicted, the economic injustice compounds the moral injustice. He was robbed of a decade of his life and his economic future. Even residents of Circleville who weren't directly targeted faced economic impacts. Property values in the town declined during the peak years of the letter writing. Businesses struggled. Some people lost jobs when employers relocated or closed. The total economic cost of the Circleville letters, accounting for all victims, all affected families, all community impacts, likely reached into the millions of dollars. This economic dimension is rarely discussed in true crime narratives, which tend to focus on the dramatic and emotional elements. But economic harm is real harm, affecting people's quality of life for decades. The Circleville letters case also raises philosophical questions about justice and closure. What does justice look like in a case like this? Paul Fresher was convicted and imprisoned, but if he wasn't the letter writer, then justice wasn't served. The real perpetrator remained free, unpunished. Even if Paul was guilty, he was only convicted of attempted murder for the booby trap, not for the decades of harassment. Is that sufficient justice? Does it address the full scope of harm caused? Mary Gillespie never received a public apology or acknowledgement from the letter writer. She never heard an explanation of why she was targeted, what she'd supposedly done to deserve such treatment. She died without those answers. Is justice possible without truth? Without knowing who wrote the letters and why? Can there be any real sense that justice has been achieved? These are questions without easy answers. Closure is similarly complicated. In many criminal cases, closure from a verdict, a sentence, a definitive end to the legal process. But in the Circleville case, even after Paul's conviction, uncertainty remained. The victims couldn't achieve closure because they couldn't fully believe the case was solved. The letters continuing after Paul's imprisonment prevented that sense of finality. For decades, Mary and others lived in a state of suspended resolution. They couldn't move on because the threat might not be over. They couldn't fully grieve because they didn't know the full truth. This lack of closure is its own form of torture. Humans need endings, need to make sense of events, need to categorize experiences as finished or ongoing. The Circleville letters denied that basic psychological need. Some victims of the letters found personal closure by deciding to stop caring about who wrote them. They made peace with not knowing, accepted that they'd never have answers, and focused on rebuilding their lives despite the uncertainty. This is a pragmatic approach, but it requires tremendous psychological strength. It means accepting injustice, accepting that the perpetrator won in some sense by escaping identification and punishment. Other victims never found closure. They remained fixated on the mystery until their deaths, unable to let go, unable to move forward. The question of closure in the Circle case highlights a broader truth about unsolved crimes. The living must eventually choose between endless seeking and acceptance of mystery. Neither choice is fully satisfying. The investigation into the Circleville letters, when examined in detail, reveals both the dedication of law enforcement and the fundamental limitations they faced. In the early days of the letter writing campaign, when the first letters arrived in late 1976, the Circleville Police Department treated them as a nuisance rather than a serious crime. This was understandable given the context. Anonymous letters, while disturbing, weren't typically associated with physical violence. The police took statements from Mary Gillespie and Gordon Massey, filed reports, but didn't devote significant resources to investigation. This initial response, though reasonable at the time, allowed the letter writer to become emboldened. When no consequences followed the first letters, the writer sent more, each one more aggressive than the last. After Ron Gillespie's death in August 1977, The police recognized they were dealing with something more serious than a prank. The letter-writing campaign had contributed to a man's death, even if indirectly. The investigation intensified. Detective Robert Thompson of the Pickaway County Sheriff's Department became the primary investigator assigned to the case. Thompson was a veteran officer, methodical and thorough. He understood that solving this case would require painstaking attention to detail and enormous patience. Thompson's first task was to collect and catalog every letter that had been sent. He contacted known victims and asked them to turn over any letters they'd received. He also put out a public appeal, asking anyone in Circleville who'd received suspicious anonymous letters to come forward. The response was surprising. Dozens of people came forward with letters. Many had kept them secret, afraid of embarrassment or not wanting to get involved. But Ron's death had changed the calculation. People now understood this was serious, potentially deadly. Thompson assembled a collection of over 200 letters. He laid them out, compared them, looked for patterns. The letters varied in content, but they shared common features. All were typed on what appeared to be the same typewriter, an older manual model. Specific letters had distinctive imperfections. The lowercase was slightly elevated. The O had a small break in the upper right. There was slightly smudged. These imperfections were consistent across the letters, strongly suggesting a single typewriter, which in turn suggested a single writer. All were mailed from Circleville or nearby towns, based on postmarks. The writer never traveled far to mail the letters. Most used standard business envelopes. White common brand available at any office supply store. Nothing distinctive, the typing quality varied slightly. Some letters had more errors, suggesting they'd been typed quickly. Others were clean, suggesting the writer had taken time to proofread or had retyped to eliminate mistakes. The language used was consistently harsh, moralistic, accusatory. The writer positioned themselves as a moral authority, condemning sin and immorality. Some letters contained specific details about victims' lives, where they'd been, what they'd worn, who they'd spoken to. This suggested either direct surveillance or access to information through gossip networks. Thompson consulted with a typewriter expert, hoping to identify the specific make and model used to write the letters. The expert examined the imperfections and concluded the typewriter was likely a Royal or Smith Corona manual model from the 1960s or early 1970s. Thousands of such typewriters existed in central Ohio alone. Without the actual machine, linking it to a specific owner would be nearly impossible. Thompson also consulted with a psychologist to develop a profile of the likely letter writer. The psychologist's assessment aligned with what Thompson had already intuited. The writer was likely someone living in or near Circleville, with deep connections to the community. The writer was probably middle-aged or older. Given the old-fashioned typewriter and the moralistic tone of the letters, the writer had time to devote to the campaign, typing letters, conducting surveillance, planning. This suggested someone without demanding full-time work or someone with a flexible schedule. The writer was probably male, given the aggressive tone and the eventual escalation to physical violence. The writer harbored deep resentment toward Mary Gillespie and possibly Gordon Massey, suggesting some personal connection or perceived grievance. The writer was intelligent and methodical, able to sustain a complex campaign over years without making obvious mistakes. This profile narrowed the suspect pool somewhat, but it still left hundreds of potential suspects in the Circleville area. Thompson began interviewing people, starting with those closest to the victims. He questioned Mary's neighbors, her co-workers at the school district, parents of children on her bus route. He questioned Gordon Massey's colleagues, his friends, his family. He asked each person where they were at various times, whether they owned a typewriter, whether they had any grudges or conflicts with the victims. Most people cooperated, but the interviews yielded little useful information. Everyone claimed ignorance. Some offered theories or suspicions about other people, but these were usually based on gossip or personal animosity rather than evidence. Thompson also investigated the possibility that the letter writer was someone from outside Circleville, perhaps someone with a past connection to the victims. He checked whether Mary or Gordon had any enemies from previous jobs, previous relationships, previous conflicts. Again, nothing significant emerged. The investigation was hampered by the nature of the crime. There was no crime scene to examine, no physical confrontation to reconstruct. The letters appeared in mailboxes, delivered by postal workers who had no knowledge of their content. The chain of custody was broken before anyone even realized a crime had occurred. Thompson tried to work with the Postal Service to identify who might be mailing the letters. Postal workers were asked to watch for anyone mailing multiple letters in white envelopes, anyone behaving suspiciously at mailboxes. But this surveillance was impractical. Circleville had numerous mailboxes, and the letter writer could use different boxes each time. Postal workers couldn't monitor every mailbox constantly. And there was nothing illegal about mailing letters. The crime was the content, which postal workers couldn't know without opening the mail. The investigation reached a frustrating impasse. Thompson had theories, had suspects he considered more likely than others, but he had no evidence that would support an arrest or conviction. One name that surfaced repeatedly in Thompson's notes was Paul Fresher. Paul had come to Thompson's attention for several reasons. First, he was Ron Gillespie's brother-in-law, connected to the family and privy to inside information. Second, several people who knew Paul described him as odd, socially awkward, capable of holding grudges. Ron himself had suspected Paul before his death and had mentioned this suspicion to a few close friends. Thompson interviewed Claude Shaw times between 1978 and 1982. Paul was cooperative but guarded. He denied any involvement in the letter writing. He claimed to have no knowledge of who might be responsible. Thompson asked Paul if he owned a typewriter. Paul said he didn't. Thompson asked if he could search Paul's home. Paul refused, saying he wanted to consult with a lawyer first. This refusal raised Thompson's suspicions. But it was also Paul's legal right. Without probable cause, Thompson couldn't force a search. Thompson kept Paul on his list of suspects, but couldn't justify focusing on him exclusively. There were other suspicious individuals, other people with potential motives or opportunity. The investigation continued through the late 1970s and early 1980s, with occasional bursts of activity when new letters appeared or new leads emerged, but mostly settling into a low-level background effort. Then in August 1983, the booby trap changed everything. When Mary Gillespie discovered the device on the side of the road and immediately reported it, law enforcement responded with full force. This was no longer just harassment, this was attempted murder. The device was carefully dismantled and transported to a forensic laboratory. Experts examined every component, looking for evidence. They found multiple fingerprints. Most were smudged or partial, useless for identification. But several clear prints were recovered from the box, from the gun, and from the trigger mechanism. These prints were run through the fingerprint database. In the 1980s, this was a manual process, involving technicians comparing prints by eye to cards in filing cabinets. It was time-consuming but effective. The prints matched Paul Fresher's fingerprints, which were on file from a previous minor legal matter years earlier. When Thompson got the news, he felt a surge of vindication. He'd suspected Paul for years. Now he had physical evidence. Thompson obtained an arrest warrant and went to Paul's home. Paul was taken into custody without incident. The interrogation that followed was intense. Thompson and other investigators questioned Paul for hours, confronting him with the fingerprint evidence, demanding explanations. Paul's explanation was simple but problematic. He claimed he'd been driving on that road, had seen the box, had stopped to examine it out of curiosity. He'd touched lightly, then realized it looked dangerous and left it alone. He hadn't reported it because he didn't think it was serious, or he didn't want to get involved. His explanation varied different retellings. Thompson didn't believe him. The explanation seemed too convenient. Yes, it was theoretically possible that Paul had innocently stumbled upon the device and touched it. But combined with Paul's connection to the victims and the years of suspicion, it seemed far more likely that Paul had built the device. The forensic experts were asked to determine if Paul's fingerprints were consistent with someone who had built the device, or someone who had merely touched it after it was already assembled. The experts couldn't make that determination with certainty. Fingerprints show that someone touched an object, but they don't reveal intent or context. However, the placement of some of Paul's prints on internal components that wouldn't be visible or accessible unless the device was being assembled suggested to investigators that Paul had built it, not just touched it. This interpretation was debatable. Defense experts would later argue that the prints could have gotten onto internal components through transfer or through Paul's attempts to examine the device. But the prosecution felt they had enough for a case. Paul Freshour was charged with attempted murder. The trial in 1984 a focal point for the community. The courtroom was packed with spectators. Media coverage was intense. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Paul Freshour's fingerprints were on a device designed to kill Mary Gillespie. Paul had motive, some grudge or obsession with Mary. Paul had opportunity, he knew her route, her schedule. The conclusion was inescapable. Paul built the booby trap. The prosecution also introduced evidence about the letters, arguing that the booby trap was the culmination of a long harassment campaign. They showed the jury some of the letters Mary had received, painted a picture of escalating obsession and violence. The defense's case was equally straightforward. Paul's fingerprints proved he touched the device, nothing more. The prosecution had no witnesses who saw Paul build it, no evidence of him purchasing the materials, no confession. The entire case was circumstantial. The defense argued that Paul had been truthful. He'd seen the box, examined it out of curiosity, and left. His fingerprints were innocent. The defense also challenged the connection to the letters. There was no evidence Paul wrote the letters. Their typewriter was found in his possession. No handwriting analysis linked him to any correspondence. The prosecution was trying to conflate two separate things, the letters and the booby trap, without proving Paul was responsible for either. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The case was difficult. The fingerprint evidence was strong, but the defense had raised reasonable doubt about what it proved. Ultimately, the jury concluded that the fingerprint evidence, combined with Paul's connection to the victim and the suspicious nature of his explanation, was sufficient to convict. Paul Freshour was found guilty of attempted murder. At sentencing, Paul addressed the court. He maintained his innocence, insisted he'd been truthful about how his fingerprints got on the device. He said he understood the jury's decision. The evidence looked bad, but he was telling the truth. The judge sentenced Paul to 7 to 25 years in prison, a substantial sentence reflecting the serious nature of the crime. Paul was led away to begin his sentence. For many in Circleville, this felt like closure. The letter writer had been caught, convicted, imprisoned. Justice had been served, but for others, doubts remained. The case against Paul was circumstantial. The letters continuing after his imprisonment would eventually vindicate those doubts, at least partially. Detective Thompson, who had invested years in the investigation, felt conflicted. He believed Paul was guilty, believed the conviction was just. But he also recognized the case wasn't perfect, that questions remained unanswered. The investigation into the letters didn't stop with Paul's conviction. Officially, the case remained open. If Paul wasn't the letter writer, then someone else was, and that person needed to be identified. When new letters appeared in 1985 and beyond, while Paul was imprisoned, Thompson and other investigators scrambled to respond. They analyzed the new letters, compared them to the old ones, looked for any changes that might indicate a different author. The typewriter appeared to be the same. The tone was similar. The content was consistent with the earlier letters. This presented a problem. Either Paul had an accomplice who was continuing the letters to make Paul look innocent, or Paul wasn't the letter writer at all. Thompson investigated the accomplice theory first. He looked at Paul's wife Karen, his children, his close friends. Anyone who might be loyal enough to Paul to continue such a campaign on his behalf. Karen was the obvious suspect. She had access to the victim's information through her family connection. She had motive to help Paul. He was her husband. She might have the typewriter, might have been helping Paul all along. Thompson interviewed Karen multiple times. She was hostile, understandably, given that her husband was in prison and she was being accused of heinous crimes. She denied any involvement. She claimed Paul was innocent, that the conviction was a miscarriage of justice. Thompson asked to search her home. Karen, on advice of her attorney, refused. Thompson tried to obtain a search warrant, but the judge was skeptical. The evidence for Karen's involvement was thin, just speculation that she might be helping Paul. Without more concrete probable cause, the warrant was denied. Thompson surveillance. He had officers watch Karen's home, track her movements, see if she went to mailboxes with letters. But this surveillance was sporadic. The department lacked resources for constant monitoring, and it yielded nothing incriminating. Thompson also investigated whether Paul could somehow be sending letters from prison. He contacted the prison, asked about Paul's mail privileges, asked if Paul had access to typewriters. The prison confirmed that Paul's outgoing mail was monitored and logged. He could send letters to family and his attorney, but every piece of mail was screened. There was no evidence Paul had sent any anonymous letters. Paul had no access to typewriters. The prison had typewriters for administrative use, but inmates weren't allowed to use them unsupervised. It seemed impossible that Paul was sending the letters from prison. Thompson was stuck. The letters continued, but he couldn't identify the source. His primary suspect was in prison, apparently unable to be responsible. The investigation dragged on through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. The letters appeared occasionally, were analyzed, added to the case file, but led nowhere. Thompson retired from law enforcement in the early 1990s, the Circleville letters case still unsolved. He devoted a significant portion of his career to it, had achieved one conviction, but had never fully solved the mystery. In interviews years later, Thompson remained convinced that Paul Freshour built the booby trap and deserved his conviction for that crime. But Thompson admitted he was less certain about whether Paul wrote the letters. The continuation of letters after Paul's imprisonment troubled him. Thompson speculated that perhaps there were two people involved, Paul and an accomplice, and that the accomplice continued alone after Paul's arrest. But he also acknowledged this was just a theory, unsupported by hard evidence. Other investigators who worked on the case had different perspectives. Some believed Paul was completely innocent, framed or simply unlucky. Others believed Paul was guilty of everything: the letters, the booby trap, all of it, and that someone else was sending copycat letters to muddy the waters. The lack of consensus among investigators reflects the fundamental ambiguity of the case. The forensic analysis of the letters, both the original batch and the letters that appeared after Paul's imprisonment, provided some insights but no definitive answers. Typewriter analysis confirmed that the same typewriter was used for the vast majority of letters, spanning from 1976 through at least the mid-1990s. This suggested a single author, or at least a single typewriter shared among multiple authors. The typewriter itself was never found. Investigators searched Paul Frereur's home after his arrest. This search was conducted with a warrant obtained after the booby trap discovery, but no typewriter matching the characteristics was found. This was used by Paul's defenders as evidence of his innocence. If Paul was the letter writer, where was his typewriter? Why couldn't it be found? The prosecution argued Paul must have disposed of it before his arrest, perhaps sensing he was under suspicion. Or perhaps he'd hidden it somewhere outside his home. But this was speculation. The absence of the typewriter was a gap in the prosecution's case. Linguistic analysis of the letters showed consistent patterns. The writer had a particular style, formal but aggressive, moralistic, prone to repetition and emphasis. The vocabulary was relatively limited, suggesting someone without extensive education, but the grammar was generally correct. Some analysts noted that the letters showed familiarity with religious language and biblical references, suggesting the writer might be someone involved in church activities. Others noted that the letters showed knowledge of local geography, local gossip, and local institutions, confirming the writer was embedded in the Circleville community. But these observations didn't narrow the suspect pool significantly. Many people in Circleville fit this profile. Handwriting analysis was impossible since the letters were typed. However, a few letters included handwritten elements, a word added in pen, a notation in the margin. These handwritten samples were analyzed, but they were too limited to be definitive. One sample was compared to Paul Freshour's handwriting and was deemed possibly consistent, but not a definitive match. This ambiguous finding helped neither the prosecution nor the defense. Forensic analysis of the paper and envelopes also yielded little. The materials were common, available at numerous stores in the area. No unique marks or characteristics could be identified. In the modern era, DNA analysis might have been able to extract touch DNA from the letters or envelopes, potentially identifying the sender. But this technology didn't exist during the active investigation in the 1970s and 1980s. By the time DNA analysis became available, most of the letters had been handled by numerous people, victims, investigators, forensic technicians, contaminating any potential DNA evidence. A few letters were tested in the 2000s, but the results were inconclusive. Multiple DNA profiles were found, likely from the various people who'd handled the letters over the years. The forensic evidence, ultimately, was frustratingly limited. It confirmed that a single typewriter was used, suggested the letters came from a local resident, but couldn't identify that resident. The psychological impact on investigators who worked on the case is worth noting. Several officers became obsessed with the Circleville letters, devoting enormous amounts of time and emotional energy to solving it. This obsession took a toll. Marriages suffered. Mental health declined. The frustration of working so hard on a case and never fully solving it was corrosive. Detective Thompson himself acknowledged that the case haunted him. He'd think about it at night, unable to sleep, turning over theories and evidence in his mind. He'd see Paul Fresher's face in his mind, wondering if he'd helped convict an innocent man, or if he'd successfully put a dangerous criminal behind bars. Other investigators had similar experiences. The case became personal, became part of their identity. Even after they moved on to other work or retired, the Circleville letters stayed with them. This psychological burden on investigators is often overlooked in discussions of unsolved or partially solved cases. We think of victims' trauma, but the investigators who devote themselves to seeking justice also suffer. The legal aftermath of Paul Fresher's conviction was complex and prolonged. Paul filed numerous appeals from prison, arguing that his conviction was based on insufficient evidence, that the jury had been prejudiced by the introduction of the letters, and that his constitutional rights had been violated in various ways. Most of these appeals were denied. The appellate courts ruled that the trial had been conducted properly, that the jury had been presented with sufficient evidence to reach a verdict, and that Paul's rights had been respected. One appeal focused on the continuing letters as evidence of Paul's innocence. Paul's attorney argued that the letters appearing after Paul's imprisonment proved he wasn't the letter writer, and that this new evidence warranted a new trial, or at least a reconsideration of the conviction. The court's response was legalistic but understandable. Paul had been convicted of attempted murder based on the booby trap, not based on writing letters. The continued letters, even if they proved Paul didn't write them, didn't prove he didn't build the booby trap. The two crimes were related but separate. The attempted murder conviction was based on fingerprint evidence that Paul never adequately explained. That evidence remained valid regardless of who wrote the letters. This ruling was legally sound but felt unjust to many observers. The booby trap and the letters were clearly connected. The booby trap targeted Mary Gillespie, the primary victim of the letters. To treat them as completely separate seemed to miss the larger pattern. But courts operate on narrow legal grounds, and the ruling stood. Paul's final appeal was denied in the early 1990s. He'd exhausted his legal options. His conviction would stand. He served his sentence, was released on parole in 1994, and lived the rest of his life under the shadow of the conviction. Paul gave a few interviews after his release, always maintaining his innocence. He described the conviction as the great injustice of his life, something he could never fully overcome or escape. In one interview in 2005, Paul was asked directly, "Did you build the booby trap?" His response, "No, I touched like I said, but I didn't build it. I don't know who did, but it wasn't me." "Did you write the letters?" His response, "No. Never wrote a single one. I don't know who wrote them either." Asked, "Why would someone frame you?" His response, "I don't know. Maybe I was just convenient. Maybe the real letter writer saw an opportunity to put suspicion on someone else. Or maybe it was just bad luck. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, touched something I shouldn't have, and it destroyed my life." The interviewer noted that Paul seemed sincere, seemed genuinely aggrieved by what had happened to him. But sincerity isn't proof of innocence. Guilty people can be convincing liars, and innocent people can seem guilty through nervousness or poor presentation. Paul's claims of innocence remain unverified and unverifiable. The theories about who really wrote the Circleville letters, if it wasn't Paul Fresher, have proliferated over the decades. Each theory has its proponents, its circumstantial evidence, its logical appeal. But none has been proven. One persistent theory focuses on Karen Sue Fresher, Paul's ex-wife, and logic behind suspecting Karen is straightforward. As Ron's sister, she would have had intimate knowledge of the Gillespie family, would have known about Mary's work, her routines, her relationships. She would have been privy to family conversations, family tensions, family secrets. Some theorists suggest that Karen harbored resentment toward Mary for reasons that were never publicly known. Perhaps there was a family conflict, a perceived slight, some interpersonal tension that festered and grew into obsessive hatred. Karen would have had opportunity. She lived in Circleville, had access to typewriters through work or personal ownership, could easily mail letters without suspicion. The theory becomes more complex when considering Paul's involvement. Did Karen and Paul work together initially? Did Karen write the letters while Paul provided information or support? Or was Karen acting alone, and Paul's fingerprints on the booby trap were coincidental, exactly as he claimed? Some versions of this theory suggest that Karen built the booby trap and deliberately used materials or components that Paul had touched, ensuring his fingerprints would be found. This would explain the physical evidence while maintaining Paul's innocence. When Paul was convicted, according to this theory, Karen continued writing letters to create the impression that the real letter writer was still free, hoping to eventually exonerate Paul. But the evidence for Karen's involvement is thin to non-existent. She was investigated extensively and nothing incriminating was found. She had no apparent motive that investigators could identify. Her denial seemed genuine. The theory about Karen persists primarily because she's one of the few people who perfectly fits the profile: local resident, family connection, access to information. But fitting a profile isn't evidence of guilt. Another theory points to someone within the school district administration. This theory suggests that the letter writer was a colleague of Gordon Massey's, someone who worked in the school system and had access to information about both Gordon and Mary. The motive, according to this theory, might have been professional jealousy. Perhaps someone resented Gordon's position as superintendent, wanted to undermine him, and targeted Mary as a way to create scandal around Gordon. Or perhaps someone in the school system harbored personal resentment toward Mary, seeing her as receiving favoritism or special treatment, and used the affair accusations as a weapon. This theory would explain the detailed knowledge about Gordon and Mary's professional lives, their schedules, their interactions. Someone working in the school district would observe these things daily. The theory faces challenges, though. Many school district employees were investigated. Their homes were searched with consent or with warrants. No evidence was found linking any specific individual to the letters. Moreover, the letters continued for decades, long after Gordon Massey left the school district. If the motive was professional undermining, why continue after the target had already left? Still, some investigators over the years have felt that the answer lies somewhere in the school system, that someone close to that environment was responsible. A darker theory suggests that Ron Gillespie himself might have been involved in the early letters. This theory is controversial and painful for Ron's family to consider, but some analysts have proposed it based on certain patterns. The theory goes like this: Ron, suspecting or knowing that Mary was having an affair, began writing letters to her as a way to pressure her to confess or change her behavior. He couldn't confront her directly without admitting he knew something he shouldn't know, or without provoking a marital crisis he wasn't ready for. The letters to Gordon Massey and others were meant to create external pressure, to make the situation untenable so that the affair would have to end. But the letters took on a life of their own. They spread beyond Ron's control. He couldn't stop them without revealing himself as the author, which would destroy his marriage and his reputation. The theory suggests that Ron's pursuit of the letter writer on the night of his death was actually an act of desperation or self-destruction. Perhaps he was chasing someone he'd paid to send letters on his behalf, or perhaps the whole pursuit was staged, and his death was suicide disguised as an accident. After Ron's death, according to this theory, someone else who knew about Ron's involvement, perhaps a friend he'd confided in, or an accomplice, continued the letters, either to honor Ron's memory, to protect his reputation, or for their own twisted reasons. This theory is deeply troubling and has been vehemently rejected by Ron's family. They point out that Ron was the one who seemed most determined to find the letter writer, most enraged by the letters. His actions don't match someone who was secretly writing them. Moreover, the letters continued for decades after Ron's death, which would require a very dedicated accomplice willing to sustain a campaign for someone who was dead. The theory is compelling only in that it explains some otherwise puzzling elements: Ron's obsessive investigation, his suspicions that seemed to land on family members, his fatal pursuit. But it requires accepting that Ron was a very different person than those who knew him believed. Most people reject this theory as both implausible and cruel to Ron's memory. Another theory focuses on the possibility of a completely unknown outsider, someone not on any investigator's radar. This theory suggests that the letter writer was someone who had a brief, intense interaction with Mary Gillespie or Gordon Massey, perhaps a parent of a child on Mary's bus route, or a resident who had some minor conflict with Gordon in his role as superintendent. This person, with mental health issues or personality disorders, fixated on Mary and Gordon, constructed an elaborate fantasy about their lives, and began the letter writing campaign. This person might have been skilled at appearing normal, at blending into the community, while harboring secret obsessions. They might have moved away from Circleville at some point, which would explain the eventual cessation of letters, or they might have died, or they might still be there, elderly and silent. The appeal of this theory is that it explains why no one close to the victims was ever convincingly implicated. The letter writer wasn't close to them. They were on the periphery, observing from a distance, building their campaign from fragments of overheard gossip and surveillance. The problem with this theory is that it's unfalsifiable. Without any specific suspect, it's impossible to investigate or prove. It essentially says, the letter writer was someone we don't know about, which is frustratingly vague. Yet another theory, popular among conspiracy-minded analysts, suggests that multiple people were involved, not as coordinated accomplices, but as independent actors all targeting the same victims. This theory proposes that the first letters were written by one person, perhaps someone with a genuine grievance or delusion about Mary and Gordon. But as the letters became known in the community, others joined in, writing their own letters in a similar style, contributing to the campaign. These additional writers might have had their own motives: personal dislike of Mary or Gordon, enjoyment of the chaos, mental illness, or simply malicious entertainment. The letters from different authors would have slightly different tones or focuses, but all would target the same people and share similar themes, creating the impression of a single obsessed writer. This theory would explain some of the inconsistencies analysts have noted in the letters over the years. It would also explain how the letters could continue changing circumstances. Different authors might pick up the campaign at different times. The main evidence against this theory is the typewriter analysis. If different people were writing letters, they'd likely use different typewriters. But the forensic evidence suggests a single typewriter was used for the vast majority of letters. Unless multiple authors somehow shared access to the same typewriter, which seems unlikely and complicated, the multi-author theory doesn't hold up. A more recent theory, proposed by a journalist who investigated the case in 2015, suggests that the letter writer was a woman who had an unquieted romantic obsession with Ron Gillespie. According to this theory, this woman loved Ron, wanted him for herself, and saw Mary as an obstacle. The affair accusations against Mary were designed to destroy Ron and Mary's marriage, clearing the way for this woman to pursue Ron. When Ron died, the woman's grief and rage intensified. She blamed Mary for Ron's death. If Mary had just admitted the affair was false, if she'd done something differently, Ron wouldn't have been out there that night. The letters after Ron's death were punishment, revenge against Mary for getting Ron killed. The journalist who proposed this theory claimed to have identified a specific woman who fit this profile. Someone who knew Ron, who was single and potentially lonely, who exhibited signs of obsessive behavior. However, the journalist never publicly named this woman, citing legal concerns and lack of definitive proof. Without a name or specific evidence, the theory remains speculative. The theory is psychologically plausible. Unrequited love can spawn obsession and hatred. The specific focus on Mary, the sexualized nature of many letters, the decades-long campaign, all could fit this profile. But without evidence, it's just another theory in a case crowded with theories. Some investigators and analysts have considered the possibility that Paul Fresher did write the letters, but that someone else built the booby trap and framed him. This inverted theory suggests that Paul was the anonymous harasser, writing letters for years but never intending physical violence. He was satisfied with psychological torture. Then someone else, perhaps someone who knew about Paul's letter writing, perhaps someone who discovered it by accident, decided to escalate to attempted murder. This person built the booby trap and deliberately ensured Paul's fingerprints would be on it, either to frame Paul or simply using materials Paul had touched. When Paul was arrested and convicted, he couldn't defend himself by admitting he wrote the letters, because that would make him look even more guilty. So he maintained complete innocence, denying both the letters and the booby trap. The letters continued after Paul's imprisonment because Paul was indeed the letter writer, and he found a way to continue from prison, perhaps by dictating letters to a visitor who would then type and mail them, or through some other method that evaded prison monitoring. This theory is convoluted, requiring multiple layers of deception and conspiracy. It's not impossible, but it requires accepting a very complex scenario. The evidence against it includes the fact that no method for Paul to send letters from prison was ever discovered, despite investigation. And it doesn't explain Paul's fingerprints on the booby trap. If someone else built it to frame Paul, how did they get his fingerprints on internal components? Through all these theories, certain facts remain undisputed. Someone wrote the letters. Someone terrorized Circleville for decades. Someone's hatred or obsession was so intense, so sustained, that they devoted years of their life to tormenting others. That person was never definitively identified. They may have died without ever being caught. They may still be alive somewhere, elderly, perhaps still in Circleville, keeping their secret. The frustration of the case is that it seems like it should be solvable. This wasn't a random crime by a stranger passing through. This was a local person, embedded in the community, operating for decades. Someone knew them, someone might have suspected them, yet they were never caught. The modern true crime community has taken considerable interest in the Circleville letters case. Online forums, Reddit threads, YouTube videos, and podcasts have all featured extensive discussions and amateur investigations. These amateur investigators have brought fresh perspectives and sometimes impressive research to the case. They've digitized old newspaper articles, interviewed surviving witnesses, created timelines and maps, analyzed language patterns in the letters. Some have claimed to have solved the case, identifying specific individuals as the letter writer. But these solutions are always based on circumstantial evidence and speculation. When pressed, the amateur sleuths acknowledge they can't prove their theories, only argue for their plausibility. The online community has also preserved the case's history in ways that official channels haven't. Many police records for 1980s have been lost or destroyed. But amateur researchers have collected and archived newspaper clippings, court documents, interviews, creating a comprehensive digital record. This crowdsourced preservation is valuable, but it also perpetuates speculation and sometimes misinformation. Not all online theories are created equal, and separating credible analysis from wild conjecture can be difficult. One fascinating development in recent years has been the use of linguistic analysis software to study the letters. These programs can identify patterns in writing style, vocabulary choice, sentence structure, elements that might reveal the author's identity, or at least narrow the suspect pool. An analysis conducted in 2018 by a linguistics professor examined digitized versions of the letters, comparing them to known writing samples from various suspects, including Paul Freshour. The analysis found that the letters showed consistent linguistic patterns suggesting a single author for the majority of the letters. This contradicted theories about multiple writers. The vocabulary level suggested someone with average education, high school graduate, possibly some college, but not advanced education. The syntax pattern suggested someone older, possibly born before 1950, based on certain phrasings and grammatical choices that were more common in earlier generations. When compared to Paul Freshour's known writing samples, the linguistic analysis found some similarities but couldn't make a definitive match. The professor concluded that the samples were possibly consistent, but that there wasn't enough material to be certain. Similar analyses comparing the letters to other suspects' writing have been equally inconclusive. Linguistic analysis is a powerful tool, but it has limitations. Writing style can vary depending on context. Someone might write very differently in a personal letter versus an anonymous threatening letter. And without a large sample of someone's writing to compare against, it's difficult to establish patterns reliably. The question of motive remains central to understanding the case. Why would someone devote so much time and energy to this campaign? What did they gain? Psychological experts who've studied the case suggest several possible motivations: power and control. The letter writer might have felt powerless in other areas of their life. Writing letters gave them power over others, the ability to cause fear and disruption. This sense of power could be addictive, compelling them to continue. Revenge: the letter writer might have felt wronged by Mary Gillespie or Gordon Massey in some way, real or imagined. The letters were revenge. Punishment for a perceived injury. Moral crusading: the letter writer might have genuinely believed they were fighting immorality, exposing sin, protecting the community. They saw themselves as righteous, justified in their actions. Entertainment: as disturbing as it sounds, the letter writer might have simply enjoyed the chaos they created. Watching people suffer, watching the investigation fail, watching the community tear itself apart, this might have been perversely entertaining. Mental illness: the letter writer might have suffered from delusions, paranoia, or other mental health conditions that drove their behavior. They might have believed things about the victims that weren't true, or might have had a distorted perception of reality. Any combination of these motivations could be at play. The truth might be more complex than any single explanation. Understanding motive might help identify the writer, but it could also be a dead end. The letter writer's internal world, their thoughts and feelings, might be so alien to normal psychology that under's impossible without their own explanation. The Circleville letters case has influenced how law enforcement and legal systems handle stalking and harassment cases. In the 1970s, harassment by mail was not taken as seriously as it should have been. The initial police response to the letters, treating them as a nuisance rather than a serious threat, reflects the attitudes of that era. But the escalation to violence in the Circleville case demonstrated that harassment can be a precursor to physical harm. The letters weren't just annoying. They were part of a pattern of escalating obsession that ultimately led to a death and an attempted murder. Modern law enforcement is trained to recognize these patterns, to take harassment seriously from the beginning, to understand that psychological violence can evolve into physical violence. Many states have strengthened their stalking and harassment laws in the decades since the Circleville letters, making it easier to prosecute these crimes and providing more protection for victims. Ohio, where Circleville is located, enacted stronger anti-stalking legislation in the 1990s, partly in response to cases like this one. These laws expanded the definition of stalking to include electronic communication and patterns of behavior, not just physical following or threatening. The Circleville case is sometimes cited in training materials for law enforcement, used as an example of how harassment campaigns can be sustained, sophisticated, and dangerous. It's also used as a cautionary tale about the importance of forensic evidence and the difficulty of solving crimes that leave minimal physical traces. Modern investigators are encouraged to use all available tools: digital forensics, surveillance technology, DNA analysis, to build cases against harassers before the harassment escalates. The case has also influenced how victims of harassment are supported. Mary Gillespie suffered for decades with inadequate support systems. Today, victim advocacy organizations provide counseling, legal assistance, and practical help to people facing similar situations. The recognition that harassment causes real psychological harm, that victims need support and protection, has grown significantly since the 1970s. The Circleville letters case in its horror and tragedy contributed to that recognition. The letters themselves, as artifacts, have been studied by criminologists and psychologists as examples of threatening communication. The specific language used in the letters, the combination of moral outrage, explicit sexual content, and personal threats reflects patterns seen in other harassment cases. But the Circleville letters are unusual in their volume and duration. Most harassment campaigns burn out relatively quickly. The harasser loses interest, gets caught, or the victim finds a way to escape. Sustaining a campaign for decades is rare. The Circleville letter writer's dedication is chilling. This wasn't an impulsive act of anger that faded. This was sustained, deliberate, methodical. Year after year, the writer sat down at their typewriter, composed letters, mailed them, and waited for the results. What kind of person has that level of sustained hatred or obsession? What kind of psychology allows someone to compartmentalize their harassment, to type letters threatening someone's life, then go about their daily routine, interacting normally with others? These questions fascinate criminal psychologists, but they remain largely unanswered in the absence of knowing the writer's identity. One aspect of the case that deserves attention is how it demonstrates the limits of community knowledge and informal surveillance. Circleville was a small town. People knew each other. They watched each other, gossiped, paid attention to who was doing what. This type of informal community surveillance is often assumed to prevent crime. Criminals can't operate in plain sight when everyone is watching. But the Circleville letter writer operated successfully for decades despite this surveillance. They attended community events, shopped at local stores, interacted with neighbors, all while secretly terrorizing people. This suggests either remarkable discipline and compartmentalization, or that the letter writer was someone so innocuous, so beyond suspicion, that no one ever seriously considered them. It's possible that people in Circleville unknowingly interacted with the letter writer regularly, said hello to them on the street, sat near them in church, stood in line with them at the grocery store, never realizing who they were. This is deeply unsettling. It challenges the notion that communities can protect themselves through vigilance and awareness. If a determined, intelligent predator wants to hide in plain sight, they can. The case also illustrates how harassment can become normalized over time. In the early years, each new letter was shocking, terrifying. But after years of letters, they became routine. Victims still suffered, but the acute shock faded into chronic dread. This normalization is dangerous. It means the harassment becomes background noise rather than an urgent crisis demanding response. It allows the harasser to continue indefinitely because the community adapts rather than actively fighting back. Mary Gillespie's experience reflects this. In the early years, she reported every letter, sought help, tried to make it stop. But after years of futility, she simply endured. She accepted that the letters were part of her life, something she had to live with. This acceptance wasn't resignation, it was survival. But it also meant the letter writer won in a sense. They'd successfully created a permanent state of fear and violated Mary's sense of safety beyond any possibility of recovery. As the years have passed since the peak of the Circleville letters, the case has faded from daily consciousness in the town but remains part of its identity. Circleville today is different in 1970s and 1980s. The population has changed. Many people who lived through the letters have died or moved away. Younger residents know about the case primarily through stories or internet research. But the case still casts a shadow. When Circleville is mentioned in broader contexts, the letters often come up. The town is known for this mystery as much as for anything else. Some residents resent this association. They want Circleville to be known for its community spirit, its annual pumpkin show, its local businesses, not for an unsolved crime. Others have embraced the notoriety in a sense, Recognizing that the case brings attention and even some tourism, true crime enthusiasts visit Circleville, drive past the locations associated with the case, visit the local historical society to learn more. This dark tourism is controversial. Some see it as hellish, disrespectful to the victims and their families. Others see it as natural human curiosity and an opportunity to educate people about the case and keep pressure on finding answers. The Circleville letters have been featured in numerous true crime productions, documentaries, podcasts, television series, books. Each production brings a wave of renewed interest, new theories, new amateur investigators. Some of these productions are respectful and well-researched. Others sensationalize or get details wrong. The victims' families have limited control over how the story is told, which can be frustrating and painful. The Circleville Letters case stands as one of America's most enduring mysteries, a testament to how terror can be weaponized through nothing more than words on paper and envelopes in mailboxes. For over 2 decades, someone sat at a typewriter and crafted psychological torture. They knew their victims intimately, watched them, studied them, and methodically destroyed their lives letter by letter. The campaign claimed Ron Gillespie's life, shattered Mary Gillespie's peace forever, and derailed Gordon Massey's career. It transformed an entire community, turning neighbors into suspects and trust into a luxury no one could afford. Paul Fresher served 10 years for attempted murder, his fingerprints sealing his fate. Yet the letters that appeared during his imprisonment whisper a disturbing possibility that justice may have been incomplete, that the real architect of Circleville's nightmare walked free while an innocent man sat in a cell. Or perhaps Paul was guilty of the booby trap but not the letters. Or perhaps the truth is more complex than any theory can capture. The letter writer possessed patience that borders on the incomprehensible. Most criminals caught because they make mistakes, because urgency breeds carelessness. But this person demonstrated discipline across decades. They never slipped, never revealed themselves through anger or pride. They remained a ghost. What kind of hatred sustains itself for 20 years? What psychological makeup allows someone to compartmentalize such cruelty, to terrorize by night and blend into normalcy by day? These questions haunt everyone who studies the case. The victims are gone now. Mary Gillespie died in 2019, carrying her trauma to the grave. Ron has been dead for over 4 decades. Gordon Massey passed in 2016. Paul Fresher died in 2012, maintaining his innocence to the end. The primary players in this terrible drama have all left the stage, but the mystery remains. Somewhere in archives or attics, that typewriter might still exist. Somewhere, perhaps, someone knows the truth. A child who discovered something disturbing among a deceased parent's belongings. A confidant who kept a terrible secret, or the letter writer themselves, now old and silent. The case reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence or spectacle. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a mailbox typed on white paper. Sometimes it wears the face of a neighbor, a friend, someone you'd never suspect. Circleville learned that lesson the hard way. A small town where everyone knew everyone discovered that knowing someone's face doesn't mean knowing their heart. Someone among them held secrets dark enough to destroy lives, and they may have taken those secrets to their grave. The Circleville letter writer won in the end. They escaped justice, escaped identification, and left behind only questions and suffering. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this case, leave a comment and subscribe. Good night and stay safe.